Imagine it's a winter night in the 1920s. A young woman walks home from the factory after a long shift. It's dark. The street lamps are few and far between, but you can see her coming from a block away, because she's glowing. Her hair shimmers faintly green, her fingertips give off a soft light. When she smiles, even her teeth seem to glow. To the people of the town, the dial painters were a kind of local magic. Everyone knew them. They were young, some barely 15, and they made good money doing delicate, fashionable work. They glittered like fireflies on their way home. Nobody knew yet that the glow was killing them. This is the story of the Radium Girls. It's a story about a miracle that turned out to be a poison, about companies that knew and said nothing, and about a handful of dying women who refused to go quietly, and in doing so, changed the world. Let's go back to the beginning. In 1898, in a cold laboratory in Paris, two scientists named Marie and Pierre Curie isolated a brand new element. It was rare, it was strange, and it did something no one had ever seen before. In total darkness, it glowed, a faint, eerie, blue-green light that never went out. They called it radium. To people at the time, radium seemed less like a chemical and less like science, and more like something out of a fairy tale. It gave off heat, it gave off light. It seemed to contain a limitless, mysterious energy that came from nowhere. And so, very quickly, the world fell completely in love with it. This is the part of the story that's almost hard to believe today, because radium didn't just go into laboratories, it went into everything. There was radium toothpaste, sold with the promise of a brighter, glowing smile. There was radium face cream, radium soap, radium hair tonic. There was radium chocolate. There were glow-in-the-dark cocktails. Wealthy people paid enormous sums for radium water, bottled water laced with the element, which they drank by the glassful, convinced it would cure everything from arthritis to old age itself. Radium was advertised as the secret to energy, beauty, and eternal youth. Doctors prescribed it, magazines praised it. The richer you were, the more of it you consumed. People genuinely believed it was good for you. So when the new industry sprang up that used radium to make things glow in the dark, no one was the least bit afraid. They were excited. And nowhere was that more true than in a brand new line of work. One that would, for a brief and shining moment, seem like the best job a young woman could possibly get. It started with watches. Someone realized that if you mixed glowing radium powder into paint, you could coat the numbers and hands of a watch and they would shine in the dark. Suddenly, you could check the time at night without a candle or lamp. It was genius. And the timing could not have been better, because the world was about to need millions of them. During the First World War, soldiers in dark trenches needed to read their watches, their instrument dials, their compasses, and gun sights without lighting a match that might give away their position. Glowing dials became essential military equipment. To make them, companies hired young women by the hundreds. The work was considered perfect for them because it demanded small, steady hands and enormous patience. The numbers on a wristwatch are tiny. Painting them required a brush with a point finer than a sewing needle. For the girls of working-class towns, this was a dream job. The pay was excellent, far more than they could earn in a regular factory. The work was clean, indoors, and respectable. And there was something glamorous about it. They weren't sewing or canning vegetables. They were artists, working with a magical glowing material that the richest people in the world paid fortunes for. The factories filled with teenage girls and young women. Many were sisters, many were best friends. They sat in long rows at their tables, laughing and gossiping and painting, surrounded by the soft green shimmer of radium dust that settled over everything. Their clothes, their hair, and their hands. Some of them started having fun with it. They'd paint their fingernails with the glowing paint for a fun night out. They'd paint their teeth so their smiles would light up. One girl reportedly coated her whole face to surprise her boyfriend in the dark. Why wouldn't they? Everyone said radium was good for you. But there was a technique they'd been taught, a small, simple habit, repeated thousands of times a day, that was about to become the most important detail in this story. Here was the problem the painters faced. The brush. To paint a number as small as the ones on a watch face, the brush tip had to come to an absolute perfect point. But after a stroke or two, the bristles would splay out and lose their shape. So the woman needed a way to repoint brush over and over all day long. Their managers taught them the solution. It was quick and efficient. You put the brush between your lips, you twirled it on the fine point, you dipped it in the radium paint, and you painted the number. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. Hundreds of times an hour. Thousands of times a day. With every single dial, the woman swallowed a tiny amount of radium. Some of the girls actually asked about this. They asked whether it was safe to be putting the paint in their mouths, and they were reassured again and again that it was completely harmless. After all, radium was the miracle element. People paid to drink it. If anything, their supervisors implied the women were lucky. They were getting it for free. So they kept going. Lip, dip, paint. Day after day, month after month, year after year. Inside their body, the radium was doing something nobody understood. When you swallow radium, your body makes a terrible mistake. Chemically, radium looks almost identical to calcium, and your body uses calcium to build bone. So your body takes the radium and does exactly the wrong thing with it. It tucks it away deep inside your bones, treating this deadly element like a building block, and it stays for years, for decades. Radium doesn't simply pass through. Buried in the bone, it sits and quietly radiates, bombarding the living tissue around it, day and night, from the inside with no way out. The women had no idea. They felt fine. They glowed, they laughed, they collected their good pay. And then, one by one, they began to fall ill. The first signs were strange and easy to dismiss. It often started in the mouth, which makes a grim kind of sense, since that's where the brush had been. A tooth would ache, the dentist would pull it, but instead of healing, the socket would refuse to close. It would fester, the pain would spread. One of the very first to suffer was a young dial painter whose story would come to symbolize the whole tragedy. Her toothaches turned into something no dentist had ever seen. Her jaw became infected, then began to crumble. The deterioration was so severe that at one point her dentist reached into her mouth and without any force at all lifted out a piece of her jawbone in his fingers. The doctors were baffled. They had no framework for what they were seeing. They gave it a nickname that would become infamous, Radium Jaw. But they didn't understand the cause, and the companies certainly weren't going to help them figure it out. When that first young woman died, her death certificate didn't say radium. It said she had died of syphilis. That detail matters, so sit with that for a moment. A young woman was poisoned at her workplace, and when she died of it, her good name was quietly stained with a disease that carried enormous shame at the time. It deflected blame away from the company and onto the dead woman herself. It implied she brought it on through her own immorality. It was a lie, but it was a convenient lie. And she was only the first. Across the factory, other women were getting sick. Their teeth were falling out, their bones were aching, backs, hips, legs. Some developed limps. Some saw their legs mysteriously shorten as the bone collapsed. Tumors began to grow. Many were exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix, growing pale and weak as their blood itself began to fail. These were women in their 20s, some still teenagers, and they were dying slowly, painfully, and without any explanation. But here's the thing. By now, some people did have an explanation. They just weren't sharing it. This is the part of the story that turns from tragedy into something darker. The company that made the paint had been founded by a brilliant scientist who knew radium intimately. He understood its dangers far better than the girls painting dials ever could. In fact, the scientists and executives who handled radium in the labs took precautions for themselves, using protective screens, tongs, and lead aprons to keep their distance from the very material they told the woman to put in their mouths. The men protected themselves. The girls licked their brushes. As the woman started getting sick, the company's response was to not investigate honestly. It was to protect itself. When concerns were raised, the company commissioned reports, and when an early study suggested the work might be dangerous, those findings were buried. The company hired its own doctors to examine the women. Those doctors ran tests and then handed back reassuring results. The women were told they were fine. They were told there was nothing to worry about. In some cases, the woman later learned the company had medical evidence of radium poisoning and simply withheld it, telling sick, frightened young women that they were healthy while knowing they were anything but. Meanwhile, the public line never changed. Radium was safe. Radium was wonderful. The illness had nothing to do with the work. There's a haunting footnote here. The founder of the company, the man who had invented the glowing paint in the first place, would himself die of radium poisoning. The element he had championed killed its own creator. Even the people who profited from radium couldn't escape what it did. But for years, the women on the factory floor were kept in the dark, both literally glowing and figuratively kept from the truth. The companies were betting that the women were too poor, too uneducated, and too sick to fight back. They bet wrong. For a while, it looked like the truth might stay buried with the bodies, but a few people refused to let it go. A determined medical examiner began to investigate the strange cluster of deaths. Where the company doctors had looked for reasons to do nothing, he looked for the truth, and he had the scientific skill to find it. He developed ways to detect the radioactivity hiding inside the women's bodies. He had them breathe onto sensitive instruments and discovered their very breath was radioactive. He tested their bones. The evidence was undeniable. These women were, in the most literal sense, radioactive. Their skeletons had been turned into something like slow internal nuclear reactors, and the radiation had been quietly destroying them from the inside for years. For the first time, there was hard scientific proof connecting the women's suffering to the work they had done. And there was one more chilling discovery. The radium inside them would never fade away in their lifetimes. Not in 100 years, not in 1,000. Radium has a half-life measured in centuries. The poison in their bones would keep radiating long after the women themselves were gone. In fact, this is true even today. When some of these women were later exhumed, their bones still set off radiation detectors, decades after their deaths. Their remains are still faintly radioactive now, and will remain so for centuries to come. Armed with proof, the women finally had something they'd never had before. A case. Now, they just had to find someone willing to fight it. Here's where a few ordinary women became something extraordinary. One of them had worked at the factory for years before the illness came for her. She was determined, sharp, and absolutely refused to accept that she would die in silence while the company that poisoned her walked away clean. But getting justice was almost impossible. Finding a lawyer took years. Many turned the case down, afraid to take on a powerful corporation or convinced it couldn't be won. There were legal time limits that the women had unknowingly already blown past, partly because they'd been lied to about what was wrong with them. The deck was stacked against them at every level. Eventually, a young lawyer agreed to take the case, and a small group of dying women joined together to sue. By the time the case reached the public, the women were visibly heartbreakingly ill. Some could barely walk. Some couldn't sit up straight, their spines crumbling. One could no longer raise her arm to take the oath in court. They were wasting away in real time, and everyone could see it. The newspapers picked up the story, and the public was horrified. These young women, poisoned at work, lied to by their employer, and now slowly dying. Someone gave the group a grim, unforgettable nickname that captured exactly what the world was watching: the Society of the Living Dead. The company tried to delay, and delay is a powerful weapon when the people suing you are dying. Every postponement raised the odds that the plaintiffs would simply pass away before the case was resolved, making the whole problem disappear. But the public pressure had become enormous, and finally, the company settled. The women won compensation, money for their suffering, payment of their medical bills, and a yearly sum for as long as they lived. For some, as long as they lived turned out to be a cruelly short time. It was not enough. No amount could have been, but it was something almost no poison worker had ever achieved before. An omission, in effect, that a company could be held responsible for what its work did to the human beings who did it. It was only the first battle. Because, while one group of women was fighting in one state, the very same thing was happening somewhere else. Another radium dial company in another town was using the exact same techniques, and watching the exact same illnesses appear in its workers. And just like before, the company knew. It had medical evidence that its women were being poisoned, and just like before, it lied to their faces, posting reassuring notices and telling the women they were perfectly healthy. One of these women became the heart of the second great fight. She was a wife and mother, and by the time she went to court, she was so sick she could no longer stand. She weighed next to nothing. She was, by an honest measure, dying. And she testified anyway. Because she was too ill to travel, the hearing came to her. She gave her testimony from her own home, lying down, surrounded by people who could see plainly that she only had weeks to live. She described the work, the brushes, the lies, the years of being told she was fine while her body fell apart. She won the case. She died within days of that victory, and even then, it wasn't over. The company appealed and appealed again, dragging the fight on past her death, all the way up through the courts, but every appeal was rejected. The verdict held. The woman had won, definitively and finally. The message could no longer be ignored. Companies could not poison their workers and escape the consequences by hiding behind their own money and their own lawyers. So, what did these women change? Almost everything about how we treat workers. Their cases helped establish a fundamental principle that we now take completely for granted: that you have the right to a safe workplace, and that if your employer's negligence harms you, you can hold them accountable. The legal fights of the Radium Girls became landmark cases in occupational health law, and they fed directly into the safety regulations and worker protection systems we rely on today. But the impact went even further than law. The scientific study of what radium did to these women produced something invaluable: hard data on what radiation actually does to the human body. And just a few years later, the world would desperately need that exact knowledge. When scientists began working with radioactive materials on a massive scale, including on the atomic projects of the Second World War, the safety standards that they used to protect those workers were shaped in part by what they had learned from the dial painters. In other words, the suffering of these young women almost certainly saved the lives of countless people who came after them. The limits we set on radiation exposure, the precautions, the understanding of how these substances behave inside the body, much of that foundation was laid in the bones of the Radium Girls. They were not scientists, they were not activists, not at first. They were ordinary young women who took what seemed like the best job in town, and through no fault of their own, they ended up teaching the world one of the most important lessons of the 20th century, written, quite literally, in their own bodies. There's one last thing worth thinking about. The radium that killed these women is still out there. It's still in the ground where some of them were buried. If you took a detector to certain old graves, the needle would still move. The element that made them glow on their walks home all those years ago is still glowing now, faintly, in the dark, and it will go on glowing for thousands of years, long after everyone alive today is gone. In a strange and somber way, that's kind of a monument. These women have left a mark on the world that will outlast empires. They started out as the girls who glowed in the dark, a local curiosity, something pretty and harmless to point at. They ended as a warning the world could never afford to forget: that no profit is worth a human life, that the people who do the work deserve the truth, and that even the smallest, most powerless person can stand up to the largest company in the world and win. They were told they were fine. They knew they were not. And because they refused to stay silent, the rest of us are safer today.